Hello everyone, it's time for another deck profile, this time on the Almajestar Astroea Unica deck. Or, in this case, you could just call it the Almajestar deck, introduced at set 9, and I have to say, it's a pretty cool deck, cool concept with some issues. Obviously, as an introduction, the deck is bound to have some issues until the next set where it kind of fixes some of it, but overall, it's a pretty cool deck and pretty fun. And I also like the design of it too, especially the witch design, it just looks cool. So that design already appealed to me at first. I originally wasn't going to play it until the style came in the anime, being revealed that it's going to be focusing on soul blasting triggers, which is the main playstyle of the deck. And the soul blasting trigger part reminds me of Genesis with divine gauges, but overall I think this new take of it actually is more unique and pretty much more fun. So now I just gave my thoughts to it. How does this deck functions? Like I said, similar to divine gauges in a way, you want to be using your triggers for soul, aka soul charging your triggers as soon as you can, and then using them as costs. In particular, crits. This deck focuses around critical triggers, so you have to maximize your critical triggers. And this is because of Astroea itself. Because more critical triggers means more power practically. Once you reach a certain amount, you're pretty much good. Until the Masques comes out, where it's just more critical triggers means more power. But right now, as you can tell, because I said you need to soul charge triggers, that does become a problem because there's no direct soul charging in this deck, meaning that you're going to need to rely on RNG to soul charge, and because it's triggers that you're trying to soul charge, you're going to be lowering your trigger count from your deck, which is going to be another issue that this deck will have. Now luckily this is dark state, so soul charging is not much of an issue here. But one advantage that you can take is early guard potential, because you do have drop zone soul charging for this deck, and in particular mainly for this archetype. So you do have that as an advantage as well. And that would mean that you can technically use the other non-trigger cards from your soul to your advantage as well. So there is that as your advantage. So overall, there are ups and downs for this deck. It's just cool concept, hence why I like it. And I also like the design of it, so I just end up building the deck. And I normally would not do a deck profile on its introduction, but because Masques, aka the masked unit or corrupted form of it, comes out in the next set right after, that instantly most likely changes the deck immediately. So I decided just like do this as Unica now, and then just do a Masques when that comes out. And trust me, that one also has a lot of decks too. But who knows, once there's more Astroea stuff specifically made more for Unica, I'll probably make it more as a Unica deck. Who knows? But anyway, no more wasting time, and let's start off with deck profile. Of course, ride deck first. So here's the starter. Almajestar Muchi. Typical starter, but it's Almajestar, so that might still matter at some point. Well, we go to Almajestar. I'm gonna tell you this right now. I'm gonna accidentally call him Almajestar for most of this video because I got a brain fart. But it's actually pronounced Almajestar. So we got Almajestar Sparta, which has the skill where when rolled upon by the grade 2 Dorna, you can soul charge 2. If you manage to soul charge a crit, you draw a card. And here's the part where you want to be soul charging crit. And that's why I said you were going to be focusing mainly on the crits, but you're still going to be focusing on soul charging triggers. Because of the other ability where if your opponent's Vanguard is greater or greater, you can buy in a trigger unit from your soul, and this card gets with 10k power in a turn. This will become a thing because of the grade 2. And yes, it has equals in its name, but you don't actually pronounce equal in its name, so I don't know. It's like the Zorga part. But anyway, moving on to the grade 2, Almajestar Turandina. So when rolled upon by Astroea, you can call itself along with the grade 1 Sparta from your soul. That is pretty good. That's a +2 right there. And not like soul really matters for this deck anyway, other than your grade 0 trigger units. In which you can actually play the second skill where act rearguard once per turn. If your Vanguard is Almajestar, you can counterblast 1 to choose up to 2 trigger units from your drop zone and put them to soul, and this card gives us 5k. Luckily it's not on play, so you don't need to deal with that part, but the fact that you can reuse your triggers means more soul blasting potential power, especially when you go to Almajestar Astroea Unica. So it has 2 skills and both of them link to each other. I'm going to go to the second skill first, where Auto Vanguard. When this card attacks, you can Soul Blast 3, buying all the critical triggers that you Soul Blast for this cost. And then you activate the following abilities depending on the number of critical triggers in your bind zone. Hence why you want to focus on the crits. And now binding the criticals makes more sense now. If you have at least 1, you choose one of your opponent's rear guards and retire it. If you have at least 2, this card gets +1 crit. If you have at least 3, it gets drive +1. So yeah, early game pressure, no grade 3 restriction. That's pretty good. Average that you'll probably get 2 critical triggers on the first grade 3 ride, but it is possible to get the third one. Sometimes you don't get it at all because it's still RNG for the soul charge, but getting the 2 off isn't too hard, especially if you decide not to redraw those crits from your hand. So there is that as well. But yeah, it is a little bit RNG reliant on the soul charging part, but still, it is manageable on your first grade 3 ride, especially if you're going first to pressure your opponent. Now, why I went to the second skill first? Because it links to the first skill, where when your trigger's unit is soul blasted for this card's ability, you can choose one of your units and it gets +5k power in the turn. So you soul blast 3 trigger units from soul, 3 units get +5k. I normally choose itself and then the other 2 front row rear guards because, yeah, I'm gonna make the first attack of this card being 26k base, most likely with 2 crits. Why wouldn't I? Sometimes maybe 31k. But yeah, that's pretty good. This itself gives a lot of pressure, and it's nice that it's also pretty Vanguard centric, so you don't need to heavily rely on the rear guards here, because all it really is, it's just herself. That just needs the soul blast cost. And then you can basically do some damage on your opponent. So yeah, pretty cool. Of course, once you hit your 3 critical triggers in your bind zone, you're not going to need to really worry about the critical triggers in the bind zone. So how I usually do is just soul blast other triggers, just so I could re-put them in soul, because you have abilities to do that, like the Dyna. But yeah, fun concept. Still need to figure out the soul charging the trigger part from your deck though. And now to the main deck itself. Obviously, Persona Ride, you just have to run the other copies. And because it's possible to soul charge one of your copies of your Persona Ride, I run Microslava. Because when placed from hand, you can combat +1, choose a card grade that equal than or less than your Vanguard, and call it to rear guard, but if it's a grade 3, you put it back to your hand. Or if it's an order card, you also put it back to your hand. Overall, it's just there for generic usage, and since there's room, I decided to run it, and like I said, it is just possible just randomly soul charge your Persona Ride, so there's that as well. And everything not a trigger is a resource in your soul, so yeah, why not? And now to the grade 2s. Just to continue off, I run 2 more Dynas. You don't have to run 2 more. I think the one in the right deck might actually be enough based on my playtests, but you could run 2 more in your leisure, you have space. And then next, we run Crits Beat Griffin. Kind of strange that this is not a witch design, and it's not Almajestar, but hey, it plays with the deck. Because on place on rear guard, if your Vanguard is Almajestar, choose 2 trigger units from your drop zone and put them to soul. More ways to recycle your triggers, which is nice. It is on place, but still, especially the second skill where if you have at least 1 critical trigger in your bind zone, +5k power and 5k shield, and the 15k base lasts on your opponent's turn as well, which is also pretty nice. And like I said, you're going to be soul charging triggers, so you will be losing defensive value, so it's just nice that you can recover some defensive value, while this still being a pretty good offensive card, which yeah, this deck can hit brutal when everything goes right. And then finally for my last grade 2, Clean Sweep Dragon. This is the Persona Ride grade 2 from set 9 for the nation. And I have to say this is the strongest one out of all of them in my opinion, because during the turn you Persona Ride, once per turn you can counter +1, choose up to 3 cards from either player's field and put them to soul. And then for each card put, +5k. Yeah, it can remove 3 of your opponent's rear guards. Basically, if your opponent's deck doesn't revolve around soul, then this is definitely just going to be really good. And either way, your opponent still loses stuff. Now, sure, you give your opponent soul, but depending on the deck, that wouldn't matter. And another thing is mass power up for itself. And there's also the part where you can even soul charge your own cards if you need to, because sometimes you just want to put that critical trigger to soul. So yeah, of course this is going to be a run. Now to the grade 1s. First off, we start off with Arlem Carpernicus. So the skill is when this card boosts, if your Vanguard's Almajestar, choose up to 1 trigger unit from your hand or drop zone and put it to your soul. If you put from hand, you also draw a card. So just more ways to put your triggers to soul so you can soul blast them. Or in this case, you can also just recycle those triggers that are in your drop zone. That's why I put that one strategy where once you hit your 3 crits, just soul blast the non-crits so you could just recycle them. And that's the point of this card, basically. It's basically the Falcate for the deck. And that's what's nice about it. And then Goomnoom Ram, because on play Soul Charge 1, anything not trigger units is going to be just basically free resource for you to use. So drawing a card is also nice, and it's also nice to filter out your deck. because you do want to see those triggers as soon as you can, because I have faced the problem where I barely see my triggers, especially the crits. You really want to see the crits as soon as you can. Make sure that you get 3 and then you're pretty much good. So that's why Goomdom Ram is good. You could run Swirler instead, but this deck already gets a lot of power on its own, especially with Unica itself. And some of the rearguard support already gets power because of it. So I don't see Swirler as too much of an issue. I say Goomdom Ram is probably the better one just to filter out your deck. Next, Friend of the Underworld Ling, because on place you can look at top 2 to choose one to put to soul, the other to bottom. It's just choice soul charging, so it can be helpful. It's just another option that you could run. And then of course we got 4 PGs because I don't have an extra Blitz Order PG, so I just have to run the regular one. But either way, still fine. And here's a tech card I decided to run. Pandemonium Tactics. As you can tell from most of this deck, it barely uses Counterblast. You might just run this as a tech card to run Soul Charge 4. And in some ways, this card has helped me a few times, especially just by using it once. Because, yeah, that not only that filters out your deck, it also potentially can give you more triggers to your soul, which is, of course, going to be one of your goals. And, of course, you want to make sure you see the crits as soon as you can. And then finally, trigger lineup. You obviously have to run the Overtrigger. And because this deck focuses on crits, obviously, you have to run the 8 crits. Next, 3 draws, because filtering out your deck is going to be pretty important. And finally, the 4 heals, 2 of them being the counter heals. So that's it with this deck profile on my Almajestar Astroea Unica deck. I still can't pronounce it. I'm used to saying Almajestar for some reason. But ignoring that, what do you guys think of it? What other changes would you make, or what other suggestions? I just basically gave you my list, but if there's any other recommendations, go ahead. There is that one grade 1 where you can Soul Blast 1 grade 1 or higher card from your soul to put 2 grade 0s from your drop zone, which is also pretty good. But considering the amount of drop zone soul charging you got, I want more deck soul charging, so I ended up using Goomdom Ram. I would have to say that this deck is probably going to look like pretty much every other deck list so far because it's an introduction, so you don't have too many options. So obviously, you're going to be running mostly those same specific cards. At most, it's just the Pandemonium Tactics that I teched in that many people haven't played. But other than that, I pretty much had fun with this deck, even at its introduction. I like its cool concept, especially on the trigger aspect of it. Sure, it has a bit of RNG in it, but overall, it has been a really fun deck, especially because I really love the Dark State concept of manipulating the soul. Now, once when set 10 comes out, we're going to get Baiko Mask, which is the mask unit of Astroea, which is going to be changing the deck quite a bit. And since this deck practically has room, I don't think spacing is going to be much of an issue to run some of the new cards. Because some of the new cards will definitely be played for this deck, of course. And I have to say the mask unit for this deck, you could say side grade or made for a different purpose. Because Astroea Unica has really good early game pressure. But once we get the new one, that one is more of a late game card. So doesn't really change the style of the deck too much. But that one does want to play more late game aggressively. But who knows how it's going to go. Hopefully we'll get more Unica itself for support, or at least more cards that can make Unica better than just play Baiko Mask. But I'll still play Baiko Mask because, well, I already like the deck and Mask unit's pretty awesome. Who knows what's in for this deck in the future. But in that's it for this, and see you all next time.